Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Hall, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by Diane Flynt, the author of the recently published Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, The Surprising Story of Apples in the South. This is a story of history, diversity, and the future. Stay tuned. You're about to learn a lot. But first, please go visit allaboutbeer.com. There, you can find original articles, reviews, news, insights, and podcasts. You can listen to shows like Beer Travelers, Brewer to Brewer, and the All About Beer podcast simply by searching All About Beer wherever you listen to shows. This show and all of the work we do is supported by you. Please go visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer. There, a few bucks goes a long way to help keep the content fresh and fund writers, photographers, creators, and editors. And if you'd like to learn more about advertising on this show and others, please email info@allaboutbeer.com. Speaking of that, you know that's the sound of another sale on your online Shopify store. But did you know Shopify powers selling in person too? That's right. Shopify is the sound of selling everywhere, online, in store, on social media, and beyond. Take customers from picking it out to picking it up. Shopify syncs in-store inventory with Google, so when local customers search for that thing that they want that you have, bam, you're there. Demand meets supply. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/drinkbeer. That's all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/drinkbeer to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/drinkbeer. For those who say social media is a bad thing, I get it. But occasionally it can provide gems. For example, last week I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw Sean Lilly Wilson, the founder of North Carolina's Full Steam Brewery, post about a new book he was reading, Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, The Surprising Story of Apples in the South. I was immediately intrigued and reached out to the author Diane Flynt to come onto the show. She and her husband Chuck live in the Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains, where she was an apple grower and cider maker. She says, above all else, she is an insatiable learner, which led to the concept and writing of this book. She is a multiple-time James Beard Award finalist for Outstanding Wine, Spirits, or Beer Professional, and she founded the Foggy Ridge Cider Company in 1997 after leaving her corporate career, and she produced cider until 2018. There aren't nearly enough books on apples in the world, especially engaging and well-thought-out ones. But this book stands among the top in my mind, and based on what I've read, for not only the rich history and passion it provides, but also the personal narrative weaved throughout and the easy-to-understand approach, which helps put the subject in our hands. Press materials provided in advance give this description. Quote, Flynt shows how Southern apples, ranging from northern varieties that found fame on Southern soil to hyper-local apples grown by a single family, have a history beyond the region, from Queen Victoria's court to the Oregon Trail. Flynt also tells the darker side of the story, detailing how apples were entwined with slavery and the theft of indigenous land. She relates the ways Southerners lost their rich apple culture in a less than a lifetime of a tree and offers a tentatively hopeful future, end quote. I can't say enough about this book. Good things about this book, I should say. Go get it, read it, and have it to come back to time and time again. You will not be disappointed. Flynt joined me via Zoom. Here's our conversation. I'm not going to ask you to speak for the entire cider industry, but I'm also going to ask you to speak for sort of the entire cider industry. When it comes to hard cider in the U.S. right now, what's the state of things from your perspective?
Hold on. I'm not sure what age to ascribe to cider in America, whether it's adolescence or young adulthood. It is certainly out of infancy, where it was when I began my cider venture back in the late 1990s. There were just a handful of cideries when we got our license and opened our cidery in the early 2000s. And there was one big sort of mass producer, Woodchuck, in Vermont. And And then there were a handful of what today we would call artisan cider makers, people who grew all of their own fruit or most of it, and who crafted cider like winemakers make wine. They were growing fruit, they were fermenting it carefully over long periods of time. It was a vintage product. So rather than making cider every month with juice that comes on a tanker and backs up to the loading dock and pumps in the
Yeah.
tanks, they were harvesting apples in a season each fall and pressing those over the fall and winter, fermenting that vintage and doing whatever they did to it, and then repeating the next year. And that was the model that I took for Foggy Ridge Cider. I saw myself as an orchardist / cider maker, and wanted to make cider that really spoke of place and terroir and apple varieties and the Southern Appalachians and all that. And since then, cider has really evolved, and it has evolved like any consumer category. There's a wider range of products. There's more on the mass market end. Things have, some might say, devolved. I would say just diversified into all different styles of cider. I mean, some cideries kind of barely use apples. I mean, they're using lots of other juices and fruits and adjuncts and additive flavorings. And there has also been a modest flowering of artisan cider makers or vintage people who make vintage cider from fruit they grow or fruit they grow and source from nearby. And you see that all over the country. Anywhere you grow apples, you see that. And in researching this book, I found excellent cideries in Kentucky and Tennessee and Georgia and just all over the South. Of course, North Carolina and Florida, North Carolina and Virginia are full of wonderful cideries that grow fruit and make a vintage cider. So, and that's a long-winded answer, but that's my thought.
Yeah, the idea of the tanker truck, I think, is one that when I speak to farmers, when I speak to growers in the cider space, it comes up quite a bit because you're not really going to get that terroir. You're not going to really get that soul that I think really wonderful small batch made ciders give off. But that's also what the majority of cider drinkers are going for these days. In your years of producing cider, was there a way that you found to connect to those drinkers, to introduce them and to really help them explore depth of flavor when they discovered you and your ciders versus some of the tanker truck stuff?
Yeah, there wasn't the tanker truck stuff in the South when I started. There was just me. And the second cidery was Albemarle Cider Works, which was very much in our mold. And it wasn't until, Bold Rock and some of the more mass market focused came along that we saw this split in the South. So in the early days, it was people would come in our tasting room and say, "What grapes is this made from?" They didn't know what cider was. So it was a different kind of education. And when we talk about tanker trucks, I want to make sure that there's a place for every kind of cider. I mean, you talk a lot about craft beer, and a lot of beer drinkers in the country drink Miller Lite and like it just fine. And there's certainly a place for that. And I don't want to denigrate cideries that make more of a session cider, a lower alcohol, simple beverage that's quaffable and meant to be consumed and appreciated in a different way than a more nuanced artisan product. So my education early on was kind of, what is cider? What is fermented cider? And people would want to see the press, and they'd want to, smell the ferments, and that was a real education. And since then, it's been really helping consumers know the difference between a cider made from, the cheapest Red Delicious apples available, fermented in a couple of weeks, and high tannin cider apples that fermented for 8 weeks and then aged for 6 months and bottled in a method, champenoise method. It's been I think a more complex and nuanced education since then. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And it's heartening to hear as well, just because I don't regularly drink cider, but when I do, I'm always sort of blown away by the sense of place and the traditions and the thought that goes into small batch or locally made. And it's tough to find that in beer. It's it can be tough to find that in wine as well, and cider really is just such a fun product of the land that it's I like how you phrase that. You brought up the idea of Red Delicious, and in your book I was struck in the way that you had me thinking about apples almost from the jump, of how ubiquitous they are. We rarely notice them or pay attention to them, and
Right.
Red Delicious and some of these culinary apples that we see all the time, that are sliced for the Happy Meal or sliced for school lunches or held in our hand. You forget just how many different varieties are out there, or that could be out there, or that used to be out there. When you first started thinking about this book and then researching this book, is this final product what you thought the book would be, or were you pulled down rabbit holes into directions that you just didn't consider?
Oh, the latter for sure. I love your term, rabbit holes. Of course, my book is published by the University of North Carolina Press under the Ferris and Ferris imprint, which is a great honor. I just feel very honored to have been chosen to be published in that very special imprint. And as part of any book published by the UNC Press, both my proposal and my book were peer reviewed. And when the reviewers came back on my proposal, on my book proposal, one reviewer said, this is a big topic. Diane's going to have to watch out for rabbit holes. So your comment certainly rings true. And I really approach this from a humanistic standpoint. A scientific survey is to have a theorem like smoking causes cancer, and then go out and prove it or disprove it. And a humanistic inquiry is to say, I'm going to investigate the South and its apples, and I don't know where it's going to take me. And that was very much where I was and where my research was. And I really went into this with John not having a point of view to share, but I wanted to share my discoveries, the things I was learning, the surprises I made. And the subtitle of my book, The Surprising Story of Apples in the South, is really about my surprises, the many things that I did not know about my region and my fruit. For example, I was born in Georgia. I'm from Georgia, born in Atlanta and raised in a small town, West Point, Georgia, right on the Alabama line. And I knew about a paragraph about the Cherokee presence in Georgia and the erasure of that presence after the Indian Removal Act and what's commonly referred to as the Trail of Tears.
Mm-hmm.
And what I didn't know was the rich tradition that indigenous people all over the East had as farmers and as orchardists from the Seneca in New York, who were just very skilled orchardists, to the Cherokee and other indigenous tribes in the Southeast. They were cultivators of trees and predated their growing apples predated colonization in the South. And at the time of Indian removal, over half the Cherokee households in Georgia, over half the Georgia Cherokee households had mature orchards of hundreds and even thousands of trees.
That's incredible. That sort of leads into there's a chapter or section in the book, Lost. And
Mm-hmm.
I was really struck by that because there for a couple of reasons. Living in New Jersey and having grown up here, there used to be a lot of orchards, and mostly done for hard cider production. And Prohibition killed that here. And every once in a while in somebody's backyard, or walking through a forest, that previously was farmland, you might find some old trees. And every once in a while, somebody will, hopefully do some research and say, oh, wow, this is such and such variety, which hasn't been around forever, but this tree has survived for 100+ years, if not more, still bearing fruit every year. But it's very easy to forget, especially as we, here we are at the end of October, early November, with apple picking season just behind us, that, the I don't know, the entertainment, the agro-tourism that has come around for some of these things is made for Instagram, and it's kind of fun, but it can be very easy to forget the important history that apples played in everyday life, for large swaths of this of this country for so long. So bringing up, the indigenous folks and what they were doing long before we all started thinking about that, it sort of goes into this lost chapter. And I'm wondering, with the history that you've learned, the business that you've run, and where we are now, what are we missing out on in 2023 when it comes to apples?
I think that's a very astute question, because it touches on so many things. One of the things we lost was the use of apples. Today, we eat almost all our apples as fresh snacks, not even as an ingredient of a meal. And as you've referenced, from colonial days on, apples were woven into everyday life. They were consumed in many ways. They were dried, they were preserved, they were eaten fresh, they were cooked in many, many ways. They were fed to animals. They were pressed into cider. Cider, of course, is a Southern beverage. And in the colonial South, it was used as currency. Before there was a monetary system, there were two forms of currency: tobacco and cider. So it was really part of everyday life. Apple orchards, especially cider orchards, were featured in real estate advertisements and wills. They were totally integrated into life and into everyday life. And now they're just really a tiny adjunct, and we lost our need for apples for drying. We lost our need to have fresh apples that ripened in June, July, August, September. Apples like we're picking this morning that ripen in November, that will keep until April. we don't need that anymore because we have refrigeration, we have rail transport, and we have a global apple economy. If our Washington State apples are feeling kind of tasting kind of puny out late in the season, we've got apples from New Zealand and Chile. So modernization and a global economy really has kind of pushed apples, the need for these various types of apples into the corner. And what we've lost flavor, we've lost taste, we've lost the diversity of apples that do lots of things for us because we don't need them to do those things anymore. But I think the most important thing we've lost is history and culture. Each apple, because apples are reproduced sexually and have to be grafted in order to reflect the fruit of the original tree, the tree you want to replicate. Each apple reflects a human desire. Somebody in history chose Grimes Golden and grafted it because it had certain value to that person. And does the South need 2,000 apple varieties? Well, probably not. But if you ask old timers in Chatham County, North Carolina, if they can live without the Aunt Sally apple, which was only grown in Chatham County, North Carolina, they would say, "Oh no, that's part of my family. My grandmother made pies with that apple," or, "I remember my granddaddy, lifting me up to the tree to pick an apple." That's that cultural memory that we lose by losing our diverse fruit.
Is there a way for I was going to say for us to get that back, and that's not a fair way to ask that question, but are you seeing a resurgence in connection to
yeah go ahead.
No,
one thing sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was mostly done with that choppy question that I was asking you. I apologize.
No. Yeah, sorry to jump in. The one thing that the University of North Carolina Press asked me to spend more time on is Revived, the last section of my book.
Yeah.
And they wanted me to explore ways that Southerners are keeping apples in the ground. And there are lots of different models. You've already mentioned the tourism model. There's an orchard in North Georgia that's about 60 or 70 miles from Atlanta. And on a busy fall weekend, they'll have 15,000 people visit. And it's a real orchard. They have acres and acres of apples, and they make cider, and they make apple ham pies. And it's a fourth generation orchard. It's not just a farm stand with a few trees and all the apples are trucked in from somewhere else. So that's one way to keep apples in the ground. There's some preservation efforts in the South that are pretty exciting. Horn Creek Farm in North Carolina, the Georgia Heritage Orchard in North Georgia. Those are more than apple zoos. They each collect and display hundreds of apple varieties that grew in the South, and they're a genetic repository. But they're also a place for education. They teach grafting workshops. They share grafting wood. And especially in that North Georgia project, the Georgia Heritage Orchard, they're actively out there looking for lost apples and talking to people about their family apples and seeing if they can identify what they want, what they are. And they're doing some genetic testing to see if some of the varieties growing on old farms and in people's backyards could be some lost apples from the South. I think that commercial apple growers, just one final point I'd make on that. I think there's some really smart commercial apple growers in the South who are figuring out how to create a marketable create an apple market in this region when we're selling apples that are viewed as a commodity, that are a global commodity. What can Southern apples do that's distinctive? And there's some smart orchardists out there figuring that out.
More in a moment, but first, this message. Customers are rushing to your store. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. Shopify's sleek, reliable POS hardware takes every major payment method and looks fabulous at the same time. With Shopify POS, you can accept credit cards, mobile payments, and every other major payment method, all with low fees and transparent pricing starting on day one. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/drinkbeer. That's all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/drinkbeer to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/drinkbeer. And now back to my conversation with Diane Flynt, the author of Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, The Surprising Story of Apples in the South. Going back to some of the genetic testing, right? And because I'm still amazed when I find some of these trees, and this town that I live in New Jersey right now actually had an apple tree growing a couple of blocks from where we were, and family had lived in the house for, since it was built essentially, and the last person died, and some developers bought the house and rehabbed it. And I walked by one day and saw that they had just cut down this tree, and I was furious because it had been around forever, and in my mind, I was one of these days just going to go and like grab one of the apples and try to figure out what it was, and I just never did. I want people to learn from that mistake. If somebody is listening, if they're in the South or not, and finds one of these old growth trees that's in a place that is confusing perhaps, or not not a typical orchard, what is the best way of trying to figure out if that tree is, or that apple is special, potentially lost and now found? What's a good way to go about doing that?
It's complicated. It requires some sleuthing. And obviously, the first thing is to ask the owners, do you know what this apple is? Who planted it? Do you know who planted it?
I live in New Jersey. We don't talk to people. That's, yeah.
You have to change that. You have to become a Southerner, put your Southern hat on. Find out if there's any family history attached to it, which might be going back to a previous owner of that property. David Vernon in Caswell County, North Carolina, operates a great fruit tree nursery called Century Farm and Orchard, and sells trees. Is a great resource for old Southern apple varieties. And he jokes that he can tell when someone calls him asking to order an apple tree, he can tell what they're going to order by their area code and by their accent. and there are apples that are common to areas. Patrick County here, close to where I am in Virginia, they love the Virginia Beauty apple. You poll 10 people in Patrick County and ask them what their favorite apple is. I bet none of them say Virginia Beauty. And 2 counties over in North Carolina, they don't know what a Virginia Beauty apple is. So some of it is regional. There are some physical characteristics that can be useful, but apples, grow differently in different climates. So the physical characteristics are a bit hard, but we do have genetic testing now, and Washington State University is doing DNA testing on apples, and the price has fallen so that it's reasonable if you want to do just a few apples. I've learned, I was doing some research at Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is an old Quaker school founded in the early 1800s. And at one time it had an orchard on the farm property, on the college property, as well as a large farm. And when I was doing my research, a professor told me that there was a really old apple tree on campus, and would I take a look at it? And that it was perhaps in danger of falling over, and they didn't know what it was, and would I take a look at it? And it turns out this apple tree is probably over 100 years old, and nobody knew what it was. I did a little bit of light pruning after consulting several pomologists about what to do, because the entire center the entire center of this precious historic tree was rotten, and it just has outer growth. I immediately gathered grafting wood. It was last winter, and David Vernon at Century Farm and Jason Bowen, the orchardist at Horn Creek, and I all grafted the tree. So even if it blows over this winter, we have the DNA of this tree. And I sent off the material last summer to Washington State, and they were able to determine that it was a mammoth black twig. So now Guilford College has some history to attach to this beautiful old tree right in the middle of their campus.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. And so important. It's sort of then to sort of tie it back to the beginning. It speaks to that ubiquitous nature that apples have these days. We just see it all the time. We just sort of take it for granted.
Mm-hmm. Right. Students walk by this tree every day. It's right in the middle of campus. It's on a corner. It's been there for decades and decades and decades. And people once depended on that tree. They used the apples perhaps for cider. That's a great cider apple. They certainly preserved that apple. They cooked with it. They ate it. They enjoyed it. Generations used that fruit. So there's a lot of history collected there.
Is there a possibility for, or again, maybe renewed interest or budding interest in using apples for additional products like our ancestors did, but that maybe have fallen out of fashion? I mean, you cited some before, and you certainly get into it in the book, but is there, I don't know, could we see additional apple products reemerge, or has the fruit been eclipsed by other things, and collectively we're just going to think about them as snacks or sips?
Right. Oh gosh, we'd have to change our diet for sure to make that happen. But I will note that on a commercial level, one of the things that happened in the South when Washington State became such a force in the apple world was that the South, big sections of the South, turned to growing processing fruit, which is less expensive to grow, and big fruit companies moved into the Hendersonville, North Carolina, and Winchester, Virginia areas. I mean, these are global companies like now Andros Food and Gerber and companies like that. And they bought fruit. If you ate canned applesauce or canned apples in an apple pie in the mid to latter part of the 20th century, you were eating apples from North Carolina or Virginia, because that's where all the fruit was grown. The largest orchard east of the Rockies was in Winchester, and it was a processing orchard growing mostly York apples, which is a famous processing apple. And that's still there, less so in Hendersonville now, but Andros Foods, a global food processor, is in Winchester and still buys apples from the orchards there. In fact, this one story I tell in the book, it's a colleague of mine is transitioning her family orchard over to an organic orchard and is selling apples to Andros for organic baby food. And you also saw vinegar plants in West Virginia, North Carolina, and Virginia. Apple cider vinegar was made in the South. So there still is a market for processing fruit on a commercial scale. As far as a home scale and the way people eat, and what would get people to eat more fresh fruit, I think better tasting apples would, and perhaps that has. I'd have to go out and look at the data, but the popularity of some of these modern varieties like Honeycrisp.
We have them in my house constantly. Yeah.
I think that giving people another flavor and another taste experience has enlivened apples to people, has made them a more interesting fruit. whether you like Honeycrisp or not my favorite, but that's an apple that has captured a new audience. And I think anything to get Americans to eat healthier food and to eat fresh food, including fresh fruit, is a good thing. I don't think we're going to get people back in kitchens canning applesauce, though. No, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I do that every year, but in fact, I do. My grandmother made applesauce in LaGrange, Georgia, and she put red hots in it to turn them red and give a little spice to it. I don't know if that's a Southern thing or not.
Well, I'm sorry, like the candy red hots?
The candy red hots. She'd put a few red hots into each batch. And I put a few Redfield apples into each batch of my applesauce because it turns it this red fleshed apple turns my applesauce this beautiful rosy color.
Oh, I like that. You might have just done this, but I was going to ask if obviously I want everybody to go read the book, but do you have a challenge or homework or a suggestion that everyday folks can do to better connect with apples?
Oh gosh, thank you so much for asking me that. There's so many things people can do. I mean, first of all, just notice the natural world around you, not just apples, but pay attention to the growing world. Even if you live in a city, walk in a park or go for a stroll and pay attention to the natural world around you. Turn off your phone, take your earbuds out, listen to the birds, listen to the sound of leaves as you walk through them, and pay attention to the growing world around you. Our forefathers and mothers were great noticers. They had to notice the natural world because they were feeding themselves. They couldn't go to the grocery store and buy apples from New Zealand or Washington State. They had to pay attention to growing things and make use of them. And we don't have to do that so much now. I think that's one way to just connect with the world around you, and that's enriching, even if it's not apples. And for apples, if you don't shop at a farmer's market, just try new apples in the grocery store. There's a pretty good variety now of modern apples that are sold. If anybody can get their hands on a Gold Rush apple, which is a modern apple, but it's pretty widely sold, it's not going to be shiny and yellow or green or red. It's a bit of a rusty coat apple, a russeted apple, but it is just delicious. It's great for baking or cooking. It's delicious for eating. And that's a new flavor that you could try other than Honeycrisp. Okay. And then finally, if you shop at farmers markets, seek out markets that have apple growers and ask them to tell you what fruit they're excited about and tell them, try a new apple. Ask them, what are their old-fashioned apples that they have, and they'll pull some out. They'll have a few trees because they're likely multi-generation growers, and their grandparents or great-grandparents will have had a favorite apple, and I am sure it is still in their family.
Oh, that's incredible. The book is called Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, The Surprising Story of Apples in the South, and the author is Diane Flynt. Thank you, one, for writing this, and then two, for sharing your insights today. It's been a real pleasure reading this book, and I hope everybody goes and adds it to their collection because it's so important.
Well, thank you, John. You are an insightful reader and you ask thoughtful questions. You made me think. I've learned from this interview, and thank you for having me on.
You're too kind. What's your favorite apple? Tell me about it. You can email me. It's John Holl. That's JOHNHOLL at allaboutbeer.com. That's also how you can get in touch with questions, comments, and guest suggestions. A reminder, go visit allaboutbeer.com. There, you can check out the podcast page, the merch page, and read great new content, as well as the archives going back to 1979. Follow All About Beer on social media at All About Beer. And if you're interested in supporting journalism in the beer space, email us at info@allaboutbeer.com or go to patreon.com/allaboutbeer. Speaking of that, here's a quick word from this episode's sponsor. Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point of sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Shopify POS is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/drinkbeer. That's all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/drinkbeer to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/drinkbeer. Don't forget, All About Beer has a podcast channel now. Just search and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. Steal This Beer has new episodes every Monday, and the BYO Nano podcast comes out on the 15th of every month. As for this show, Mitch Weber does the music, Jeff Quinn designed our logo, and I'm John Hall. New episodes release every Wednesday, and that's when I'm going to be back again to drink beer and to think beer.